Well, let me just say, if you've got a Bible with you this morning, I want to invite you to open it to the book of Genesis and chapter 9 in that book. We are nearing the end of our series in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. It's a series that we have called In the Beginning, and I entitled today's message, A New Beginning. So if you've been around, you know that we've spent the last 3 weeks looking at sort of the build-up to the flood. We looked at the flood itself, and then last week we looked at the receding of the flood waters. The flood has wiped out most of the earth's population, with the exception of Noah and his family. And then this chapter, Genesis chapter 9, records what happened as things started all over again. So we're going to jump right into it this morning by reading Genesis chapter 9, verses 1 to 17. This is God's word, and this is what it says. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth and multiply in it." Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, "Behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your offspring after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. It is for every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Well, this is an interesting passage because it is a passage that is filled with hope, but it is also a passage that is grounded in reality. There is the opportunity here for a new beginning. Things can start all over again. But there's no pretending that this is going to take place in an idyllic world. There's a mixture of optimism and pessimism, and that mixture of optimism and pessimism reminds me of the opening line of Charles Dickens' novel, The Tale of Two Cities. The famous first sentence of that book says this: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way." Now, Dickens' novel was set in London and Paris before and during the French Revolution, and that opening sentence was a very fitting way to describe those times. They were the best of times and the worst of times. But I think it's actually a good way to describe many different periods in history, and I think it's a very fitting way to describe what we read here in Genesis 9, because this was the best of times and the worst of times. It was the best of times because the language here calls to mind the original creation. Time when there was harmony between man and God, between man and nature, and between man and woman. But there's also a dark cloud that hangs over this chapter. This new beginning has come about because of man's sinfulness, because God has sent a judgment in the form of the flood. And while it signals a new beginning or a recreation, there are plenty of reminders that this world is very different from the one that existed in the Garden of Eden. So I want to approach this passage under three main headings this morning, or three main ideas. And the first one is that judgment provides the opportunity for a new beginning. So verse 1 begins like this. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Does that sound familiar at all? Well, this is what we read in Genesis chapter 1 in the creation account. Back there we read, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it.'" God's blessing was upon the first man and the first woman. His charge to them was to propagate life and to exercise dominion over the rest of creation. Now, as God addresses Noah and his family, his original mandate is restated: be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, team on it. And this helps us understand that God's purpose has not changed. His desire from the very beginning of time has been the creation of a multitude of people in relationship with Him. And the judgment that has come has provided an opportunity for a new beginning. The first basic point I think we can draw from this passage is that God desires and blesses the propagation of life. Now, if you grew up in the church or you've been around the church for any length of time, you might just take this for granted. But this desire on God's part for the fruitfulness and the multiplication of man on the earth is in contrast to what you find in many of the other ancient flood stories. In one of the Mesopotamian flood stories, or stories of the flood was brought about because the gods were concerned that the earth was becoming too populated. The problem, as it was stated in the Atrahasis epic, was that people were too noisy. So God sent a flood. And then to prevent this kind of overcrowding from happening again, a bargain was struck between the god Enlil and the lady of birth Nintu. Here's the substance of that agreement. In addition, let there be a third category among the peoples. Let there be among the peoples women who bear and women who do not bear. Let there be among the peoples the Pasitu demon to snatch the baby from the lap of her who bore it. Establish Ugbabtu women and Entu women and Igasitu women, and let them be taboo, and so stop childbirth. This was the plan of the gods to control world population. Too many people on the earth. You know, you can actually find that sentiment in many ancient religions, and in fact, you can find that sentiment in many current worldviews as well. It marks a great contrast with the Bible's perspective on multiplication. Psalm 127 says this: "Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them." Now, I read everything that a quiver is holds anywhere from 5 to 30 arrows. So you can kind of work that out for yourselves. But this is God's perspective on children. They are a blessing. Not everyone in the ancient world saw it that way. And not everyone in the world today sees it that way. Many of you will know that up until January of this year, China had a one-child policy. You were allowed to have one child and only one child and preferably a boy, and getting pregnant with a second child was considered illegal. They made the penalty for having a second child or a second pregnancy so stiff that most of those pregnancies ended in abortion. 7 million babies a year were killed in an effort to control population. Now, the change in the policy this year to allow a second child has not come about because the government suddenly sees children as a blessing, but because the country is facing a rapidly aging population and a shrinking labor force. Now, I just spent 2 weeks in China. And one of my translators and his wife live in Shanghai. They are now expecting their second child. But as I spent time talking to the wife of this couple, she told me that even with this change in policy, everywhere you go, you see signs that say one child is best. This is what a family should look like. And even her own family has tried to talk her out of it and said, you know, it's a very foolish thing to do to have more than one child. That's been the policy for 40 years. Now, I'm not trying to get all political here. I'm not trying to throw stones from afar. But I want to say that our perspective on children ought to be the same as God's perspective on children. As Christians, we ought to seek to be fruitful and multiply. God blesses the propagation of life. Now, I need to say something about how we go about fulfilling this mandate. So we have, many of you know this, but we have 4 kids. And I think actually if we had have started younger, we may have had more than 4 kids. Not necessarily the same ones, but we would have had, you know, at least 4 like that. Now, I'm not going to tell you how many kids you ought to have, but I will say that we should start from a foundation that children are a blessing, and that God desires the propagation of life. And bearing children is one of the purposes of marriage. When the prophet Malachi speaks to the issue of divorce, he says this: "Did he," that's God, "not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union? And what was the one God seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in your spirit, and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth." So what was God seeking when he ordained marriage? Well, part of the answer, at least, is that he was seeking godly offspring. He was seeking the propagation of life. But having said all that, let me just say that the emphasis on what it means to be fruitful and multiply changes in the New Testament. I want you to listen to the charge that Jesus gave to his disciples before he ascended into heaven. Matthew 28, it says, "And Jesus came and said to them, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age.'" Now, it's an oversimplification, but the way to be fruitful and multiply in the Old Testament was to make lots of babies. The way to be fruitful and multiply in the New Testament is to make lots of disciples. Now, we do that with our kids, but we also do it beyond that, of all nations, it says. And this ought to be our desire, the propagation of life, so that as many people as possible are in relationship with the living God. Second thing we could say about this new beginning is that God gives abundant provisions for life. Look at what it says in verse 3. God says, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything." Now, the provision to eat meat, to eat from that which moves along the earth, appears to be a new thing. When you compare this verse with what was said in chapter 1, it appears to be that the people were vegetarians up until this point. In chapter 1, when God gives his original charge, he says this: And God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit, you shall have them for food. And in Genesis chapter 2, when God addresses Adam and speaks to him, he says this, the Lord commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it you shall surely die. So the food given at creation consisted of what came from the trees and from the crops. Now, I wouldn't be dogmatic about that, but the comparison of these verses does seem to point in that direction, that the addition of meat is a new thing here. But the point is that God provides what we need to sustain life. He doesn't give it grudgingly. His exact words are, I give you everything. He's filled the world with good things. He's given to them, or given them to us. There's an endless variety of good things for us to enjoy. That salmon or steak that you're going to barbecue tonight, the mango salsa you're going to scoop up with your tortilla chips, the bowl of raspberries and ice cream you're going to have for dessert, all of that is given to you by God. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. You know, I reminded myself of this verse when I was in China, and noticed just some of the different items on the menu there. So I didn't try the bullfrog stew or the peppered duck tongue, but those things are part of the everything that God has given. Now, along with the provision, God does give a single prohibition, just as he did in the garden. Verse 4 says, But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. The intention behind that prohibition seems to be the instilling of respect for the sacredness of life. As one commentator put it, adding meat to the human diet is not a license for savagery. So human beings might be at the top of the food chain, but even in that, there are limitations. God provides abundant provisions for life. We ought to be thankful for that. Third thing we see in this new beginning is that God establishes protection for life. And this is what we see in verses 5 and 6. Where it says, And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning, from every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. God establishes protection for human life. Now we'll come back to these verses and say a little more in a couple of minutes, but let me just quickly say that these verses highlight the sanctity of human life. The flow of this passage is that if animal life is sacred because of its blood, how much more valuable is human life because man is made in the image of God? And God says that he will require a reckoning for the life of man. In fact, he says it 3 times in verse 5. God says he will require this reckoning whether man's life was taken by an animal or it was taken by his fellow man. Exodus chapter 21 gives us a glimpse of how this reckoning was practiced in Israel's law code. There it says, When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. God said he would require a reckoning from both man and beast for the life of man. The reasoning behind those laws is that human life has inherent value, and that even carelessness or negligence with your animal or your vehicle around other people was a serious offense against God's image. Human life has to be reckoned for. Now, I understand that our justice system is different than what was practiced in ancient Israel. I do think that Genesis 9 provides the biblical basis for capital punishment, but I don't think that's the main takeaway we should have from these verses. When you read these verses, when you read verses 6 and 7 together, for instance, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And then you read verse 7, and you be fruitful and multiply, teem on the earth and multiply in it. You can see the flow here. That the main thrust of these verses is about the value of human life. Rather than putting an end to human life through the shedding of blood, we are supposed to promote human life and be fruitful and multiply. Now, at the practical level, I think these verses should inform the way we approach issues like abortion and assisted suicide. We believe in the value, the inherent value of human life. We believe in protecting human life. And the reason we take those positions is because this is the view God takes of human life. Now, we've been focusing on the positives in this passage so far, the ways in which this was the best of times. The fact that God gives this provision for life, that He provides protection for it. He gives us a new beginning, but I want to make sure we do full justice to the realism of what we read here in chapter 9. And what we need to keep in mind is that this new beginning takes place in a beautiful but broken world. So this passage is about a new beginning. It's as if God is a director and says, all right, let's take it again from the top. Let's start all over again. But while there's a new beginning, it's clear when you compare this chapter with chapter 1 that the world is a different place now. And this is where we really see it was the best of times, it was the worst of times on display. The world is beautiful but broken. I think we all have experience with this. I mean, many of us have experience with this every day where we kind of see the beauty in our world, but also the brokenness and the pain. That's a picture of what the real world is like. One of my most vivid memories of this came the day that our first son was born. Now, many of you know that, as you come towards the due date, your anticipation level just builds and builds, and there's a lot of excitement that comes with it. And on the day that we were due for our first child, Ilona went into labor that morning. We went to the hospital. They sent us home, and after 10 or 11 hours of labor, we went back to the hospital, and then they said, well, actually, it turns out your baby is breech, and you need to have an emergency C-section, like right now. And I remember, I will never forget the mix of emotions that I had. After they had done the operation, and they let me sort of peek over the little curtain or covering that they had put up, and there I saw my son for the very first time. But I also saw my wife there who had just been operated on, her belly cut open. And I remember just this mix of seeing beauty and brokenness. It's a picture of what our world is really like. And this is what we see in Genesis chapter 9. On the one hand, God provides everything needed for life: propagation, provision, protection. He gives the sign of the rainbow to signify that the world will never be wiped out by a flood again. But on the other hand, there's a dark cloud that hangs over this chapter. And the dark cloud comes into view when you compare Genesis 9 with Genesis chapter 1. So much of what God says here to Noah sounds just like what he said at creation. God's original mandate reads like this. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them, and God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. God said, behold, I've given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the heavens, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. Well, there's so much that is similar between those words and these ones in Genesis 9, but there are also some differences. And the two main things we see that are different here reflect the world that we live in. Firstly, we see that our relationship with nature is broken. Now, we're given the same dominion over the animals and over the things that creep on the earth, but now there's an added dimension of fear and disharmony in this relationship. It says here, the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth and every bird of the air. I already mentioned the addition of meat to the human diet, and that in and of itself changes the relationship. I mean, if there is the possibility that I might eat you, it kind of alters the relationship, right? And all we have to do is look around to see the brokenness in our world, much of it caused by us, in our relationship with nature. Now, I want to be careful here because the Bible does not teach what you could call Bambi theology. Some of you are old enough to have seen the animated movie, right? Bambi is a white-tailed deer. We watch him grow up in the forest with his mother, and then the dramatic moment of the movie comes when Bambi's mother is shot and killed by a hunter. And when you see that and you're 7 years old, the conclusion is obvious. Deer good, hunter bad. Or nature good, man bad. And there are some approaches to the environment that basically take that stance, that man is seen as kind of a blight on the earth, just wreaking havoc. That's not the Bible's perspective on our relationship with nature. Giving man dominion over nature is giving him a charge to look after it and to steward it. But the Bible is a book that's grounded in reality, and so here it paints the reality that sometimes man's dominion on the earth is exercised with severity. This is what life looks like east of Eden. There's not the same harmony between man and nature. Now, as Christians, the environment is not the ultimate thing, but it is important. Christians should be leading the way and caring for and stewarding what God has given us. And the covenant that God makes here is not just with man, but with all of creation. It's His world. Now, the world we live in is fallen, just like we are. And we ought to remember that God has a plan to redeem the earth as well as us. Here's what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Romans. When he's talking about our suffering, he says, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us," or to us. "For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now." See, our world itself needs redemption. Our relationship with it is broken in some ways. Second thing that helps us see that this new beginning takes place in a beautiful but broken world is that our relationships with each other are broken. Relationships are like this, aren't they? I mean, they can be sources of so much joy, and they can be sources of so much pain. In the original creation account, there was no need to stipulate what would happen if one person killed another person. There was no need to say, look, I'm going to require a reckoning for this. But now, in light of our inherent sinfulness, God needs to establish a standard for justice. The standard is that man has been created in God's image, and any attack upon man is an attack upon God. And since man in his natural state is hostile to God, it follows that he will be hostile to his fellow man. It's a sad state of affairs. But this is the world we live in, and you know this. And it's not just murder that reveals that our relationships with each other are broken. This is verifiable in our lives just by doing an inventory of our relationships. I mean, most of us can think of relationships in our own lives that are broken. whether it's a relationship with a sibling, a parent or an in-law, a child, a neighbor, a coworker, an employer, a former friend, former spouse. I would just say if all of the relationships in your life are free from brokenness, it's probably because you have mostly surface relationships. And I would also add that if all of the relationships in your life are free from brokenness, I'd be glad to share with you some of my relationships, right? You could just sort of take those over. Like we experience this all the time. Our relationships are broken. It's part of living in a fallen world. Third thing we learn about this new beginning is that we experience the blessings of this new beginning solely by God's grace. Verses 8 to 17 are focused on the covenant that God institutes with Noah and his sons and with all future generations. A covenant is a binding agreement between two parties. And this theme of covenant is something you can trace right through the entire Bible. So here, God makes a covenant with Noah. It's sometimes referred to as the Noahic, or the covenant of preservation. Because God promises, He covenants never to again to wipe out the earth's population the way He did with the flood. When we keep reading the book of Genesis, we see that He makes another covenant, this one with Abraham, and this is known as the Abrahamic, or the Abrahamic covenant, or the covenant of promise, because God promises there to make him into a great nation, and that through him all of the nations of the earth will be blessed. God then makes a covenant through Moses. This is known as the covenant of law, because the idea was you had to keep the law in order to experience the blessings of this covenant. If you do your part, God will give you, if you obey this way, God will bless you for that. It's a covenant of law. God makes a covenant with King David. It's known as the Davidic covenant. That covenant promised there would never fail to be a descendant of David who sat on the throne in Israel. Now here, this covenant is with Noah and with, it says, all future generations. So we're part of this. And there are some unique things about this covenant with Noah. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of them. What you see here is that God initiates a covenant that is unilateral, unconditional, and universal. Not unilateral, universal, and unilateral. So just to say, what does this mean to say that it's a unilateral or unconditional covenant? Now, most covenants in the ancient world and today are bilateral covenants. That means they're entered into by two parties, and each party has a role to play. The way this usually worked in the ancient world was that a king would conquer another nation, and what he would do is he would enter into a covenant with them. He would say, look, I will provide protection for you, and I will let you continue to exist if you will keep the terms of this agreement or covenant. You do your part, and I will do my part. Now, God makes covenants like that, but this is not one of them. Verse 8 says, I will establish my covenant with you. Verse 11 says, I establish my covenant with you. And in verse 15, God says, I will remember my covenant. This is God's covenant. He initiates it, and He is the only one required to do anything, or in this case, to not do something. Nowhere in here does it say what our responsibilities are. God simply declares that He will never again destroy the earth's population with a flood. It's unilateral and unconditional. It's also a universal covenant. Verse 10 says that the covenant is not just with Noah and his sons, but with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every beast of the earth. Everyone benefits from this covenant. And verse 12 says that this covenant also applies to all future generations. This means we still experience the blessings of this covenant. We didn't even have to do anything to get that. The rainbow becomes the sign of this covenant. This doesn't mean that there weren't any rainbows before this, but that the rainbow is given new significance for what it symbolizes, and it is a very fitting symbol for this covenant. It's as if God has hung up his warrior's bow in the sky. It's now no longer pointed at the earth, but pointed away from it. So we experience this today as God's common grace. It comes to everyone. But we also need to know something else, which is that this covenant is not enough. This is a good covenant. It's for everyone. But as good as it is, and as much as we can still experience the benefits of it, it is not enough. Now, earlier I highlighted the fact that our relationship with nature is broken. Our relationship with each other is broken. But the deeper problem is that our relationship with God is broken. It's broken because of sin, and this covenant does not solve that problem. But there is a covenant that does. It's called the New Covenant. The New Covenant was instituted by Jesus. And it is the only covenant that can actually deal with all of our sin and that can solve and remedy that problem. Now, you might remember that when Jesus was, just before he was handed over and crucified, he ate a meal with his disciples. And this is what it says in Matthew chapter 26. Now, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." You see, that is the only covenant that can adequately deal with our sins. It's the covenant in Jesus' blood. And that one we enter into by faith. We put our faith in Jesus and his sacrificial death on our behalf. That's how we experience the blessings of this new covenant. That's how we're made new and washed clean and experience forgiveness. And we celebrate this as a church every week. We celebrate it when we go to a time of communion. We declare that we are people of this new covenant, that we trust for our salvation in Jesus' death on our behalf, in the cup of his blood, this new covenant. So we're going to do that as a church. If you have accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, if you are walking in fellowship with him, you are a person of this new covenant, we invite you to participate with us. The way we do this as a church is that we come forward, we take a piece of bread, which represents the body of Christ, given for us as a sacrifice. We dip it in the wine or the juice to say, this is the covenant that we are part of. So let's do that together.